All right, welcome back to our second lecture. I want to take us a little bit further and define emerging adulthood based off some of the reading that you've been doing, especially looking at some of the work from Jeffrey Arnett, who is really the one who coined the phrase emerging adulthood. You'll find that a lot of the readings that we do will refer to him in some sort of way. So I want to give you an idea of what's happening with regards to that. So let's take a look at this. We know, and we've already talked about the fact that when it comes to emerging adulthood, we really are talking about the ages of 18 to 30. There's something unique about 18 that happens where up to 18, the typical young person, and I mean this very, very generally, usually is under the care of a parent or a legal guardian. All of a sudden they graduate high school, generally speaking, and all of a sudden the world opens up to them. There's lots of things they can choose to do after 18. So instead of being in sort of the lock and stock requirement of going to high school, they now have the opportunity to join the military. They could get a job. They could go to community college. They could go to college. They could travel the world. They could take a gap year. There's lots of things that they could do at 18. So the world begins to open up to them in some pretty remarkable ways, which does something to their psyche, which we'll talk about in a second. The other thing that's happening is that generally speaking, emerging adulthood ends around age 30. Generally speaking, sometimes it spills over into the early 30s, but something about 30 is quite unique. We find that a lot of emerging adults actually want to have some traction in life by the time that they're 30. Like if you talk with someone in their 20s and you kind of say, hey, where do you want to be when you're 30? There'll be an intensity that comes with how they answer that question. Maybe even a bit of an anxiety as they're getting closer to that number because they see that number as the space where they want some sort of traction in their life, relationally, vocationally, and oftentimes spiritually as well. And so this age range of 18 to 30 sort of fits in this space in this slide that we've referred back to. Now, we also know from what Arnett says is that there's five main features of emerging adulthood. There is this element of identity exploration, where one now is moving into a time in their life where they have the psychological ego and their brain is developing fully at age 25, but is developing in such a way that they're able to reflect on their experiences and think about what they've inherited from the adults or experiences in their lives and asking themselves, what am I taking with me? And what am I leaving behind? And what am I moving forward with? And so there's this element of asking this question of who am I? Now, this idea of identity is probably better thought about as identities because there's more than one identity. Some researchers would call this intersectionality, right? Who am I as based on my gender, based on my sexual orientation, based on my race, my ethnicity, my religious background, my socioeconomic status. All these begin to come into play as I think about who I am and what makes me me. And so there's a lot of work that goes into this idea of identity exploration. Secondly, there's this element of instability. Now, this instability for emerging adults is felt in two ways, externally and internally. The external element is the fact that they live in a world that is constantly changing. They're asked to sort of keep up. They are not completely in control of their destinies. And so there's quite a bit of instability that happens economically, socially, and a bunch of other cultural factors and sociological factors that play into that. And so they, in many ways, are trying to find their way in an unstable world of which they are a part. If we go back to the slide where they're all over the place, it's not because emerging adults just choose to be nonlinear. The reality is that they're trying to make their way in a less predictable world of getting from adolescence into adulthood. Okay. Now, the internal instability is the fact that there's something going on inside as they are wrestling with owning who they are as themselves, to be able to say I'm good at something, to discern what I want to do with my life. The way I sort of think about what I'm becoming takes an incredible amount of work, and there's something about it that feels quite unstable and unsure. And you'll read a little bit about that when we read Sharon Dallas Park's work, right? So there's this instability that's happening internally, and there's this external instability that's happening as well. And one of the ways I like to describe it is this: it's like I think sometimes emerging adults feel as though that they are having a panic attack in an earthquake. Okay. There's a lot going on inside. There's a lot going on externally, and they are just trying to navigate all this instability that's happening in there, which really leads to the third characteristics, and that is the characteristic of being self-focused. Now, oftentimes this characteristic is misunderstood as being selfish. Oh, look at those emerging young adults. There they are thinking about themselves again. Will they ever look around and think about anybody else, et cetera, et cetera? You've probably heard these things before. The way I like to think about it is this, though, is that this isn't an issue of selfishness. It's an issue of self-focused in this way. If I'm having a panic attack in the middle of an earthquake, what am I going to do? I'm going to plant my feet. I'm going to concentrate on standing up because I just don't want to fall down. My friends, that is not being selfish. That is being self-focused, trying to make it in a world that feels deeply unstable to emerging adults. And so they feel the sense of in-betweenness. They're not adolescents anymore, but they don't feel like adults yet. And a lot of times this is reinforced in society where we find that they feel very in between because what does it mean to be an adult? Is it 18 when I can vote? Is it 21 when I can drink? Is it 25 when I can rent a car? Even the cues that we have for what is being an adult have become confusing and thin. And so this makes it hard for emerging adults. I think this is true in our churches as well. Remember our first lecture that we did last week where leaders are like if they come back, what are we supposed to do with them? Like where does an emerging adult fit in a church that has a linear programming? If you are not married and having children or younger, like a teenage years, there's sort of this void as to the relationship that emerging adults have with faith communities, which becomes undefined. It can feel very disoriented. And so they feel very in between in their lives. And I think they're also faced with unparalleled possibilities. There is this sense of hopefulness that emerging adults seem to demonstrate in the research that even if things are hard or challenging, they believe that there's something better coming along and that they are hopeful for that along the way. Now, those possibilities are great because I think it opens up a world to them that perhaps they haven't had the opportunity to experience before. Compared to younger generations, especially for women, there are more opportunities career-wise and otherwise, which I think is worth worth celebrating. And at the same time, when we have unparalleled possibilities, it's sometimes that can be quite debilitating because there's so many things to choose from. How do I know which one to choose? And so this becomes a really, really challenging thing. One emerging adult said to me once that really what's out the door is FOMO, fear of missing out. And what's replaced it for emerging adults is FOBO, fear of a better opportunity, right? That if I choose something, I might miss out on something else. And so sometimes no decisions are made. This is the characteristics of emerging adults and where they live. Now, what we find in their identity formation that they're really working through three things: this idea of work, love and community, and belief or spirituality, right? So if you're like wondering, like, what do I talk about with emerging adults that they're thinking about a lot of? If you talked about work, love, friendship, community, and their beliefs, you're going to really hit the zone where they're sort of really trying to negotiate and think through these things, which I think is quite remarkable for us to think about. I think what you see here is sort of the echoes of identity, belonging, and purpose, which is a conceptual framework that we use a lot of in the Fuller Youth Institute. And we're going to talk more about that in the future. I think also we just need to realize is, if emerging adulthood is in between and they are emerging towards something, a telos, adulthood eventually, what exactly does adulthood look like for emerging adults? What we find from Arnett's research and others is that adulthood for an emerging adult is not marriage or having a job. They may be married, they may have a job, but they may not feel like an adult completely yet. Some would argue that what makes one feels like an adult when they take responsibility for themselves, when they are able to make independent decisions, and when they become financially independent. That there's something about these characteristics that seem to have a significant strength in them beginning to self-identify as an adult. The last one is really interesting. If you think about this idea of 20-somethings sort of boomeranging home, of which about 50% will do sometime in their 20s. I think in a generation or two ago, I think to move back home with one's parents was seen as an adulting fail. But if we think about this idea that many move back home in order to get rid of debt, in order to establish themselves financially so that they can move out on their own, perhaps moving home is not an adulting fail, but is actually an adulting step. Interesting that in generations you can have the same action and have different meaning. This is what we have to do when we have empathy and we lean in to this along the way. So if I could summarize all this, I really draw from two researchers, which I think are really, really crucial. Jeffrey Arnett says, look, the 20s are a time where it just takes longer to grow up today. This isn't because emerging adults are lazy. It's not because they don't want to grow up. It's that it just takes longer because more demands are placed on them to make it to be an adult and a contributing member of society. And Meg Jay, who's a psychologist, says that's true. And the 20s are also a decade of investment. That the 20s, emerging adulthood, is not adolescence 2.0. It's not an extended period of time where I can put off adult responsibilities. It is actually a decade of investment where I'm beginning to lean into who God has made me to be, who are the relationships that I want to be with, how do I want to invest in my life and what's important to me, so that as I approach 30, I'm finding the traction that I want to have. And I just wonder, I wonder if there's any institution in the world that is localized, that cares about intergenerational relationships, that brings experience and attention to young people in their 20s, that would want to invest in them. I wonder if you could think of anybody like that. That sounds like the church, doesn't it? Uh, and I believe, and I get pretty passionate about this. I'm tired. I'm really, really tired of hearing people say that young people are leaving the church, and this is really, really bad, and what's going on, and all that comes with that. Rather than perhaps saying, the church is the place that if we paid attention to the fact that emerging adults are in between and they're looking to invest in their lives so that they can have traction by the time they're 30, that the church is the place filled with experience and love and resource to actually accompany them along the way. And I'm a firm believer in that. And perhaps you want to join me in that impulse, because I think there's a tremendous amount of good news waiting for emerging adults if we're willing to step into it. So some self-questions for you. If it takes longer for emerging adults to grow up today, and this is a decade of investment, how might faith communities reimagine their role, right? That's just what I talked about. How might parents need to adjust their parenting? Remember, if emerging adults' lives are changing and it takes longer to grow up, it's certainly having a dynamic effect on their families, especially their relationship with their parents. And then also, how might this be good news and a challenge for emerging adults, this period, right? Like, how do we show compassion that it takes longer? And how do we invite them to invest in their lives in their 20s so that they can have traction by the time they are 30? A lot for us to think about there. I hope that gives you a closer look at who emerging adults are and what emerging adulthood is. I think you'll find this really helpful in your reading as well. And we'll continue to lean into this as we seek to understand emerging adults and where they say they need us the most.